Sophie had always enjoyed quiet evenings at home, the soft hum of the city outside her window a comfort she rarely sought to disturb, but tonight felt different in ways she couldn't yet put into words, a restless energy clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her husband, Daniel, had left early in the day on a business trip, and she had been looking forward to an evening of solitude, perhaps a cup of tea and a book, when an unexpected message arrived from his father, Mr. Clark, asking if he could visit and help her with some household tasks, insisting that he didn't want to impose but thought his presence might make things easier. Sophie hesitated, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness mixed with the politeness that had always guided her interactions with Mr. Clark. He had always been kind, respectful, and formal, a man who treated her with care but maintained a quiet distance that had never made her uncomfortable, until now. She agreed, telling herself that a short visit wouldn't hurt, that it would be nice to have company, and that she could manage any awkwardness with the politeness that had been ingrained in her since childhood. When the doorbell rang, she smoothed the front of her dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find him standing there with a gentle smile, dressed neatly, carrying a small bag of tools and household items he claimed he wanted to check, saying he could help with anything she needed. There was something in the way he looked at her that felt different tonight, a softness that lingered longer than usual, and Sophie noticed her pulse quicken for reasons she immediately tried to dismiss, blaming the cool evening air or perhaps her own fatigue from the day. She stepped aside to let him in, and he offered to take her coat, as he had politely done on previous visits, but this time there was a warmth in his gesture, a lingering touch that made her step back slightly and apologize, insisting she could manage on her own. He laughed softly, a sound that was gentle but carried an unexpected intimacy, and insisted, saying he didn't mind helping, that sometimes it was better to offer a hand than to let someone struggle, and Sophie found herself caught between politeness and an inexplicable tension she couldn't quite explain. As she turned to adjust a small table near the entrance, her dress caught on the corner of the furniture, causing her to stumble slightly, and she gasped, a little embarrassed, feeling the familiar heat of blush rise to her cheeks. "Oh. I think I need a hand," she admitted, her voice betraying her nervousness, and Mr. Clark stepped forward immediately, steadying her with a hand at her elbow, his touch light but firm, his presence filling the space with a quiet reassurance that made Sophie's heart skip unexpectedly. They moved slowly together toward the living room, and the air seemed to thrum with a strange energy neither had acknowledged, a closeness that felt innocent yet somehow electric, the kind of subtle tension that forms when two people share a private, unexpected moment. Sophie tried to focus on the mundane task at hand, reminding herself that he was her father-in-law, that nothing more than politeness and family care was allowed, yet every small movement, every glance, seemed to carry weight she hadn't anticipated. She felt the brush of his hand as he guided her past the furniture, and the warmth of it lingered longer than necessary, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare speak, thoughts that were unsettling in their sudden intensity. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, telling herself it was only a stumble, only a moment of awkwardness that could happen between anyone, yet the rhythm of her heartbeat betrayed her calm words, racing in a way that made her anxious and guilty at the same time. Mr. Clark smiled, a fatherly smile he always used to comfort others, but tonight it carried a softness, a depth that Sophie found herself unexpectedly drawn to, and she immediately chastised herself for feeling warmth where propriety should have reigned. They reached the couch, and as she tried to sit, she felt a slight dizziness from the adrenaline of the brief stumble, and he was there again, steadying her, making sure she was comfortable, asking softly if she was all right, and Sophie nodded quickly, grateful yet unsettled by the intensity of her own emotions. She couldn't tell if it was relief, embarrassment, or something she didn't fully understand, a tangle of feelings that left her breathless, and when their hands brushed in the process, a subtle electricity passed through her, one she immediately tried to suppress, telling herself it was imagination, a trick of fatigue, anything but what she was feeling. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound stand out, the tick of the clock, the distant hum of traffic, the subtle rustle of fabric as they adjusted their positions, and Sophie felt a peculiar intimacy in that quiet, a connection that was innocent in intention but charged in sensation, and she wondered how something so simple could feel so complicated. Mr. Clark spoke then, his voice low but clear, asking if she needed help with anything else, and Sophie shook her head, unsure if her heart could take another moment of his attention without betraying her composure. And yet part of her wanted to linger in this odd warmth, to see what more might unfold in the shared quiet of the room. She forced herself to smile, to keep the conversation light, asking him about his day, about Daniel's business trip, anything to anchor the interaction in normalcy. But her mind kept drifting back to the subtle intimacy of the brief moments before, the way his eyes had lingered on her face, the gentle care in his gestures, and she felt a rush of emotions she wasn't ready to confront. The clock ticked on, and Sophie tried to focus on arranging the cushions on the couch, straightening the small rug, anything to distract herself from the dizzying swirl of feelings. But every glance at Mr. Clark reminded her of the closeness they had shared in those fleeting seconds, and a part of her could not deny the strange pull she felt towards someone she shouldn't feel anything for beyond respect and familial connection. She remembered all the times he had visited before, the polite conversations, the small jokes he shared with Daniel, the quiet attentiveness he showed to the household, and how she had always appreciated his presence, but tonight it felt heavier, charged, an intensity that left her simultaneously flustered and fascinated. Sophie took another deep breath, trying to steady herself, and Mr. Clark noticed, pausing and asking if she was feeling unwell, and she quickly waved her hand, insisting she was fine, just a little startled by the stumble, and he chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that was warm and reassuring, yet now somehow carried a subtle, unspoken undertone that made Sophie's stomach flutter with nerves she didn't want to name. They continued their brief task, moving around the living room with a careful coordination, each aware of the other's presence in a way that was gentle, yet charged, and Sophie kept reminding herself to focus on the furniture, the cushions, anything but the warmth of the man standing beside her, the way he seemed to notice her in a way that no one else did, a quiet awareness that left her heart pounding. Minutes passed, and the conversation remained polite, surface level, but the energy in the room had shifted in ways neither spoke aloud. There was a shared understanding, a tension that was subtle yet palpable, and Sophie felt both frightened and captivated by the feeling. Finally, Mr. Clark stepped back, giving her space, saying he would tidy the kitchen while she got comfortable, and Sophie felt a strange relief mixed with disappointment, a desire for distance yet also a wish to linger, to understand what this feeling meant, and she shook her head to dispel the thoughts, forcing herself to focus on the mundane task of straightening the cushions and arranging the living room as if nothing had changed. She reminded herself of Daniel's imminent return, of her responsibilities, and of the propriety that bound her, yet a quiet, stubborn curiosity lingered, the kind that makes one replay moments in the mind, analyzing every glance, every gesture, every fleeting touch, and she realized that tonight's visit, which had begun with a simple offer to help, had created a space where emotions lingered, subtle but undeniable, where boundaries felt both respected and tested, and where the simple act of being helped had become a catalyst for self-reflection, curiosity, and a fluttering, unexpected awareness of someone she had always considered only a relative. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, and Sophie felt the warmth of the day fade, but the strange, intimate tension in her chest remained, a pulse of emotions that made her heart beat faster with every footstep he took, every quiet word he spoke, every glance that lingered a second too long, and she realized with a mix of fear and fascination that this evening, meant to be ordinary and simple, had already shifted something within her, leaving her both unsettled and captivated, wondering what more the night might hold. The evening continued with a strange, quiet tension lingering in the air, Sophie trying to convince herself that everything was ordinary, that Mr. Clark's presence was simply polite and familial. Yet every small gesture, every subtle glance, seemed to carry a weight that made her stomach tighten and her thoughts race in ways she had not anticipated, as they moved through the living room together, arranging cushions, straightening books, and tidying the small corner table near the window. Sophie found herself acutely aware of his nearness, the careful attentiveness he displayed as he ensured she wasn't straining herself, his hands moving briefly to adjust a cushion or guide her around a corner, all done with the soft, deliberate gentleness of a man who truly cared. Yet there was an undertone she couldn't place, something almost unspoken in the way he watched her, as if noticing not just her movements but the small flickers of emotion that passed across her face, the tiniest blush, the catch in her breath, and though she chastised herself for reading too much into it, she could not ignore the subtle pull, the quiet curiosity that tugged at her chest, a sensation that was at once alarming and strangely comforting, leaving her caught between the urge to retreat and the desire to linger in the delicate intimacy of the moment. Mr. Clark, aware of the careful line he walked, kept the conversation light, asking about her day, about the mundane details of running the household, but every question carried a softness, a patience, a willingness to listen that made Sophie feel seen in a way that was both familiar and disarming, as if for a few fleeting hours, she existed entirely within a bubble of understanding that had nothing to do with Daniel, nothing to do with obligations, and yet everything to do with the rare, unspoken human connection that can exist between two people who respect and care for one another. Her heart raced with each word, each smile, each pause in conversation where his gaze met hers, and she found herself nervously adjusting the hem of her dress, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve, anything to occupy her hands and to avoid the magnetic pull she felt whenever he was near, a pull that was innocent in intention but powerful in effect, leaving her thoughts swirling in confusion, curiosity, and a faint, unwelcome thrill. As they moved toward the kitchen to gather teacups, Sophie's mind wandered despite her best efforts to stay focused on the task, replaying earlier moments in her head, the stumble near the couch, the brief touch of his hand on her elbow, the warmth of his gaze as he steadied her, and she felt an odd combination of gratitude, nervousness, and the slightest spark of something she couldn't name, an awareness that lingered long after the moment had passed, an emotional residue that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. Mr. Clark, in his careful attentiveness, seemed to notice her subtle tension, though he never acknowledged it outright. He smiled occasionally, a gentle, reassuring curve of his lips, offered quiet words of comfort or encouragement when she reached for a cup or placed a saucer down, and Sophie found herself clinging to the safety of his polite concern even as it stirred feelings she knew were inappropriate to indulge, emotions she quickly tried to tuck away, reminding herself that he was her father-in-law, that she was married, and that propriety demanded she focus on gratitude and nothing more, yet every second he spent near her added weight to the unspoken intensity between them, a gravity that neither spoke of but both felt, a subtle pull that neither could define but that both were acutely aware of in the quiet moments between tasks. As they sat briefly at the kitchen counter to rest, pouring tea and arranging a small plate of biscuits, the conversation shifted naturally to family memories, stories from Daniel's childhood, moments that Sophie had heard before but that Mr. Clark recounted with such warmth, such evident affection, that she laughed aloud more freely than she had in weeks, and in that laughter, in the shared joy of remembering simpler times, she felt a deeper connection to him, a sense of being understood, of being appreciated not just for her efforts in the home but for the quiet qualities he seemed to notice, the patience in her movements, the softness of her voice, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the subtle ways she carried herself, all of which seemed to draw his attention with a care that was deliberate yet unspoken, and Sophie felt her heart flutter at the realization that someone saw her in this quiet, unguarded way. The afternoon faded into early evening, and the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window cast long, warm shadows across the counters, highlighting the subtle contours of the room and the calm expressions on their faces, and Sophie found herself momentarily lost in the sight of him, noticing the gentleness in his movements, the patience in his demeanor, and the quiet pride in the way he spoke about Daniel, all of which made her heart ache with a mix of admiration and the faintest hint of longing, a longing that she quickly dismissed as absurd, knowing the lines of propriety, yet feeling powerless against the subtle, emotional pull she could not explain. They finished their tea in companionable silence, the kind of silence that speaks volumes without words, filled with the soft clinking of cups and the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the background, and Sophie felt a shiver of awareness at the closeness, the warmth that lingered when he passed her to refill his cup or adjust a plate, the fleeting touch of his hand on her arm as he returned, all done under the guise of simple politeness but carrying a weight of human connection she couldn't deny, a quiet electricity that made her chest tighten in ways she had not expected, leaving her simultaneously comforted and unsettled. Mr. Clark, recognizing the late hour and the approaching return of Daniel, began to gather his things, moving with the same careful attentiveness, yet his movements were slower than necessary, deliberate perhaps, and Sophie felt a pang of longing as he straightened the cushions, adjusted the curtains, and checked the small details that only someone deeply invested in a home and the people within it would notice, and she realized with a quiet shock that she had been holding her breath in subtle synchrony with him, attuned to his presence more than she had expected, feeling a closeness that was intimate without words, a warmth that was at once comforting and disquieting, a realization that left her both grateful and nervously aware of emotions she could not fully name. Just as he prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway, turning to Sophie with a quiet, careful smile that conveyed a sense of care and understanding beyond the ordinary, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze, her heart caught between gratitude, admiration, and the faintest, unspoken stirrings of a connection she could not act upon, a connection that existed only in the subtle spaces between gestures, words, and the gentle rhythm of shared presence, and Sophie felt a mixture of relief and disappointment, a desire for both distance and continued closeness, a paradox that left her mind racing even as she offered a polite farewell, thanking him for his help while inwardly wondering what these feelings meant and how long they might linger in the quiet spaces of her heart long after he had gone. As the door closed behind him and the quiet returned to the apartment, Sophie leaned against the wall for a moment, exhaling slowly, feeling the rush of emotion settle into a lingering hum that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. And she realized that this evening, which had begun as a simple household task, had subtly shifted something within her, creating a tension between propriety and emotion, between gratitude and a quiet, unspoken curiosity, a tension she would carry with her into the following days, into the quiet moments when she found herself replaying each glance, each gesture, each carefully measured word, and she understood that some connections, though fleeting and unspoken, had a way of leaving marks on the heart that could not easily be erased, a gentle, bittersweet awareness that life had quietly complicated itself with emotions she neither fully welcomed nor understood, but could not ignore. The days after Mr. Clark's visit were filled with an unusual quiet, a silence that Sophie couldn't easily explain, the kind of silence that follows moments charged with unspoken emotion, and every time she went about her daily routines, folding laundry, preparing meals, tidying the living room, her mind returned to the subtle gestures, the fleeting glances, the soft words that had lingered in the air when he had been there. It was as if each moment had left an invisible thread connecting them, a quiet pulse of awareness that made her heart race even when she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than gratitude, yet gratitude alone could not account for the flutter in her chest or the warmth that spread whenever she remembered the careful attentiveness he had shown, the softness in his voice, the patience in his gestures, all done with a quiet respect that had both comforted and unsettled her. Sophie found herself recalling the small, almost imperceptible ways he had noticed her, the way he had adjusted the hem of her dress when it had caught, the brief touch on her elbow that steadied her, the gentle care with which he guided her around the furniture, all actions that were innocent on the surface but left her cheeks warm and her thoughts spinning in ways she wasn't ready to confront, every detail replayed in her mind, creating a mix of admiration, curiosity, and a quiet, almost forbidden longing she didn't dare name aloud. Daniel's absence had made her aware of the gaps in her own emotional life, the ways in which she craved attention, understanding, and human connection beyond the ordinary routines of marriage, and Mr. Clark's presence had filled those gaps in a way that was subtle, respectful, and yet powerful, making her realize that she had emotions she hadn't acknowledged in months, feelings she had tucked away under the responsibilities of daily life and the rhythms of domesticity. Sophie's thoughts kept returning to his voice, a low and measured tone that seemed to understand her without requiring explanation, a tone that had both comforted and startled her in the quiet of the living room, and she felt a peculiar tension between propriety and curiosity, between loyalty to her husband and the undeniable connection she sensed with someone who should have been only a figure of authority and respect, yet had become a source of fascination and emotional warmth. One afternoon, unable to contain the restlessness she felt, Sophie found herself mentally replaying the conversations, the small acts of care, the lingering looks, trying to understand why her heart responded so strongly to someone she had always considered family but now felt closer to in ways that were entirely unexpected, the memory of his hand brushing hers over the teacups, the way he had straightened a cushion without looking at her, the quiet attentiveness that followed her every movement, all of it created a sense of intimacy she hadn't realized she was missing, and she wondered how much of it was her own imagination and how much was a reflection of real, subtle attraction she didn't dare acknowledge. The quiet tension built over the following days, each encounter or even thought of him adding layers of emotion, a mix of admiration, longing, and uncertainty, leaving her simultaneously comforted by his gentle presence in her memories and troubled by the growing awareness of feelings that crossed boundaries she knew she could not cross. She found herself staring at the clock, imagining what he might be doing, replaying the way his gaze had met hers, the careful attentiveness in his tone, the warmth that seemed to linger in the memory of his presence, and she felt a restless energy she could neither release nor fully understand, a silent storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her composure. One evening, Sophie found herself alone in the study, dusting books and straightening papers, when a soft knock at the door startled her, and she realized that Mr. Clark had come back unexpectedly, claiming he needed to check on some old documents he had left in the room, and the brief spark of surprise she felt gave way to an undeniable flutter of nerves, her heart racing as he stepped inside, his presence filling the space with the same quiet intensity she remembered, a subtle warmth that seemed to follow him wherever he moved, making her acutely aware of every sound, every motion, every quiet shift of weight in the room. They began sorting through the papers together, and the simple act of working side by side, reaching for the same folder, brushing past each other in the confined space, created an undercurrent of tension Sophie could not ignore. A silent awareness of proximity that left her breathless and aware of the faint thrum of her own pulse, yet she kept her composure, reminding herself of boundaries, of loyalty, of the propriety that had always guided her, even as her emotions struggled to remain disciplined. Mr. Clark, for his part, maintained a careful professionalism, his gestures deliberate, his tone measured, yet there was a softness in his eyes, a quiet attentiveness that Sophie could not deny. A gentle recognition of her presence that carried with it a weight of unspoken understanding, and she felt drawn into a dance of emotion that was invisible to anyone else, a quiet ballet of gestures and glances, words and silences, that spoke volumes without breaking the rules of respect and familial boundaries. Hours passed in this delicate balance, the quiet rhythm of activity punctuated only by brief exchanges, shared observations about the documents, and occasional soft laughter at a memory or anecdote, and Sophie found herself mesmerized by the simple warmth of human connection, the way he made her feel acknowledged, seen, and appreciated in ways that went beyond polite courtesy, yet stayed within the lines of respect and restraint, and she realized that this subtle intimacy, this emotional closeness, had become something she could not easily dismiss or forget, leaving her with a lingering ache that was as sweet as it was unsettling. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed over papers or folders, and each accidental touch sent a shiver through Sophie, a quiet thrill she immediately tried to suppress, reminding herself of Daniel, of boundaries, of the expectations placed upon her. Yet she could not help the pull she felt, the curious fascination that kept her eyes lingering on his movements, on the care he showed in everything he did, on the gentleness in his voice and the patience in his gestures. And she understood with quiet resignation that these emotions were neither simple nor easily categorized, yet they were undeniably present, a subtle undercurrent in the otherwise ordinary rhythm of household tasks. When a small stack of papers slipped from her hands, Mr. Clark was there immediately to help, steadying the pile and guiding her hands, and in that brief touch, brief as it was, Sophie felt an electric awareness of proximity, a whisper of closeness that made her heart flutter, a moment of connection that was innocent in intention but powerful in effect, leaving her breathless and acutely conscious of the delicate tension between gratitude, respect, and a quietly stirring attraction she did not dare name. The afternoon light shifted through the study window, casting long, warm streaks across the wooden floor and highlighting the subtle expressions on their faces, the careful attentiveness in their movements, and Sophie felt herself caught in a strange liminal space, aware of every gesture, every glance, every soft word, a space where boundaries were maintained yet emotions surged quietly beneath the surface, an emotional storm contained within the polite structure of familial respect. By the time Mr. Clark prepared to leave, Sophie felt a mixture of relief and disappointment, a desire to be free of the intensity and yet a quiet longing for more moments of connection, moments that could never cross the invisible lines of propriety but that nonetheless left an indelible mark on her heart, she watched him straighten his coat, gather his briefcase, and pause in the doorway, offering a final smile, soft and understanding. A smile that conveyed more than words could express, and Sophie felt the lingering echo of emotion, a quiet resonance that would stay with her long after the door had closed and the room returned to its ordinary, silent state. In the solitude that followed, Sophie leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly, feeling the strange ache of longing and the bittersweet tension of emotions she could not fully define, a combination of admiration, curiosity, and the faintest spark of something she would never allow herself to name, and she realized that the events of the past days had subtly altered her world, introducing an emotional complexity that was both beautiful and unsettling, leaving her wondering how she could navigate the quiet power of human connection, the intensity of subtle attraction, and the unwavering boundaries of respect and family ties, and she understood with a quiet, bittersweet clarity that this chapter of her life, though unspoken and hidden, would leave a lasting impression on her heart, shaping her thoughts, her feelings, and the rhythm of her quiet, introspective days in ways she was only beginning to understand. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet presence of Mr. Clark in Sophie's thoughts refused to fade, lingering in subtle ways she could neither ignore nor fully understand, each memory of his gentle attentiveness, soft voice, and careful gestures replaying in her mind like a warm, persistent echo, leaving her simultaneously comforted and unsettled, aware that these fleeting moments, though innocent in appearance, had awakened emotions she could not name aloud, emotions that pulsed quietly beneath her daily routines, coloring the mundane activities of the house with a new intensity that was both thrilling and quietly alarming. She found herself noticing the smallest details, recalling the curve of his smile, the patience in his hands, the quiet warmth that radiated from his presence even in ordinary moments, and she realized that these memories had carved a subtle space in her heart that no ordinary day could erase, a space filled with longing, curiosity, and a deep, almost unspoken understanding that went beyond polite familial affection. Sophie tried to focus on Daniel, on the rhythm of their life together, on the responsibilities and comfort that his presence provided, yet even in those moments, her mind wandered. Imagining Mr. Clark's voice in response to a question, replaying his careful attentiveness, the way he seemed to notice the unspoken subtleties of her behavior, and she found herself caught between the reality of her marriage and the unexpected emotional resonance she felt towards someone who should have been only a figure of authority, only a father-in-law, yet had become a quiet, enduring presence in her consciousness, an unspoken thread that wove through her thoughts with gentle insistence. One afternoon, while organizing old family photographs in the study, Sophie discovered herself alone with Mr. Clark again, this time by circumstance rather than design. The room filled with the soft rustle of papers and the faint golden light streaming through the window, and she felt her pulse quicken at the familiarity of his presence, the way it seemed to fill the room with a warmth she had begun to crave in quiet, unacknowledged moments, a warmth that was neither physical nor overt but existed in the subtle, unspoken attentiveness, the careful consideration of her comfort, the gentle patience that marked every movement and glance, and Sophie found herself momentarily lost in the rhythm of it, caught in a delicate balance between propriety and the undeniable, quiet emotional pull that lingered whenever he was near. Mr. Clark moved with the same deliberate care he always had, guiding stacks of photographs into order, handing her albums with a soft smile, and Sophie felt the familiar shiver of awareness when their hands brushed, brief, fleeting, yet charged with a quiet electricity she could not explain, a sensation that made her heart beat faster, her thoughts race, and her emotions swirl with a complexity that was both thrilling and terrifying, leaving her acutely aware of boundaries yet simultaneously aware of how deeply these subtle interactions had affected her inner world, how fully he had become a presence in her mind that she could not simply dismiss. The conversation flowed naturally, about the photographs, about memories of Daniel as a child, about family stories that had long been passed down but were suddenly alive with a vividness she had not expected, and in each shared anecdote, in each quiet laugh, in each exchange of glances over the pages, Sophie felt a quiet intimacy blossom, a sense of understanding and connection that was gentle, refined, and yet profoundly stirring, touching corners of her heart that had lain dormant, awakening emotions she both welcomed and feared, a delicate tension that reminded her that human connection could be subtle, powerful, and quietly transformative without ever breaking rules or propriety. They worked side by side, sorting through memories and shared history, and Sophie found herself captivated by the way he seemed to notice the details, the thoughtful attention to names, dates, small notations, the care with which he handled old photographs, and in the way he looked at her when he spoke, soft eyes holding more emotion than words ever could. She felt an undeniable, bittersweet stirring in her chest, an awareness of a connection that was impossible to act on yet impossible to ignore, leaving her caught in a quiet storm of admiration, curiosity, and longing. Hours passed in this delicate rhythm, the gentle sounds of the room, the rustle of papers, the quiet clink of a photo frame being set down, the soft exhalation of a sigh, the faint hum of the street outside, blending into a kind of hypnotic background, a cadence that made every shared glance, every quiet word, every brief, accidental touch feel magnified, significant, a private conversation of emotions and presence that existed only in the silence between actions, a dialogue of hearts that spoke volumes without ever breaching the lines of propriety, and Sophie felt both exhilarated and frightened by the intensity of it. When Mr. Clark paused, leaning back to rest for a moment, he looked at Sophie with a measured gentleness that was almost painful in its depth, as if he understood everything in her silence, everything in her subtle reactions, and she felt a lump in her throat, the quiet ache of emotions that were stirring and complex, emotions that she had not permitted herself to explore before, a bittersweet blend of admiration, curiosity, and an awareness of human connection that was both innocent and profound. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room and highlighting the contours of their expressions, and Sophie noticed the careful attentiveness, the patience, the quiet care in every movement he made, the subtle warmth in his eyes when they met hers, and she felt her heart constrict with a mixture of emotion she could not name, a strange combination of longing, gratitude, fascination, and fear, all swirling together in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and fully alive, aware of the delicate beauty of human emotion, the quiet power of attention, and the unspoken connections that could exist between two people who respected boundaries yet felt deeply. As the afternoon faded into evening, Mr. Clark prepared to leave, moving deliberately, gathering his things, his movements measured but gentle, and Sophie felt the ache of wanting to prolong the moment while understanding the necessity of endings, a bittersweet tension that left her breathless with emotion, her mind racing with the images, words, and gestures of the past hours, and she realized that this connection, subtle and unspoken, would linger long after the door had closed, a quiet imprint on her heart that was both comforting and haunting. Before stepping out, he paused at the doorway, offering a soft, understanding smile, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had formed between them, a moment of connection that was fleeting yet permanent in its emotional impact. And Sophie returned the smile, a mixture of gratitude, longing, and awareness in her expression, knowing that some relationships, though never acted upon in overt ways, could leave indelible marks on the heart, shaping thoughts, emotions, and the quiet rhythms of daily life in ways that were subtle yet profound. After the door closed, Sophie leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly, her mind and heart alive with the lingering resonance of the afternoon, a blend of admiration, longing, and the bittersweet awareness of emotions that could not be expressed yet could not be denied, and she felt a quiet resolve that she would carry the lessons of human connection, the beauty of gentle attentiveness, and the transformative power of unspoken emotion with her, savoring the memory, honoring the feelings, and understanding that some bonds, though never acted upon, could enrich life in ways both subtle and enduring, leaving her heart full, complex, and quietly changed forever.